and I think it's just worth maybe making a brief comment about. People have been using a technique, including some of the people at this table, called bone speed of sound ultrasound. And it's a very simple technique where you literally put an ultrasound device on a baby's heel, actually they usually use, and you measure the speed of sound reflection, and it's a measurement of bone strength, presumably. And one of the things was found is that in our premature babies, as their bones grow, their bone speed of sound ultrasound actually decreases. That is, they're getting bigger bones, but potentially weaker for a period of time. And the question was, could a little bit of range of motion exercises, moving the extremities, improve their bone density? And there's been a couple studies of that. I think this was probably the best one, in which they showed that a group of babies who did not get exercise lost this amount of their bone, whereas those who received exercise really had no bone loss at all. This is a very small study. It certainly is just an indication of the potential for looking at this area. So I think it's important, before we go out there and put all our premature infants on physical therapy regimens for their bones, that we need a lot more evidence about that. Certainly physical therapy is important and can be, for healthy preterm infants, something that might be a reasonable thing to do. But we should use caution before starting such a program, because in particular, if we have sick babies and the baby's bones are growing rapidly and we're not giving them enough calcium to meet that need, then you can have babies whose bones will expand in size but not mineralization. And then if we do a lot of exercise to those bones, we might increase the risk of fracturing them. All right, vitamin D in premature infants. Now, for many years I used to give the talks on calcium and phosphorus and never mentioned vitamin D at all. But vitamin D has now become probably one of the most studied and most talked about nutrients in all of nutritional sciences, and everybody's interested in vitamin D. So I think we need to talk a little bit about vitamin D in premature babies again. So here's just a little bit of information about it, and we'll take it from there. Currently in the United States, the recommendation for vitamin D intake for full-term infants is 200 international units per day, which is 5 micrograms per day. The recognized upper limit, the upper safe limit, is 1,000 international units per day, which is 25 micrograms per day. There's substantial evidence that most calcium that's absorbed in the first month or so of life is not vitamin D dependent, either in premature or in full-term infants. And there's a reasonable amount of data saying that fairly modest levels of vitamin D maintain adequate vitamin D levels. And this is data, as you can see, going back really 20 years. Shown below are the contents of vitamin D that's in premature formulas sold in the United States and human milk fortifiers. These levels are a little bit different in some of the fortifiers sold in other countries. I'm aware that the Nestle version of preterm fortifier does not contain vitamin D at all, because everyone supplements vitamin D separately. So you should check and see what the levels are. But in general, the formulas and the human milk fortifiers provide about 200 to 400 units per day of vitamin D. Now, a lot of people have been interested in people of all ages in high-dose vitamin D supplementation. So the question is there any benefit to high-dose vitamin D in babies? Well, the available data don't really supply any evidence for that at all. There's really no modern evidence at all that high-dose vitamin D has any short-term or long-term benefits. There are those, however, and especially in Europe, who very, very strongly advocate giving 1,000 units or up to 1,000 units of vitamin D to all premature infants. And they feel very, very strongly about this. My only commentary is it's probably completely safe to do, and in my opinion probably doesn't provide a whole lot of benefit for the baby. But that's up to you. It's important to remember that at least in the United States, we recommend that all exclusively breastfed babies receive a vitamin D supplement, beginning not later than 2 months of age. Currently, the U.S. recommendation is 200 units per day. It will go to 400 units per day in the near future again, which is what it was in the past. There's very, very little data that's about vitamin D levels at high vitamin D intake. In a single study that was looked at very low birth weight infants, what they found is that some fairly high levels of vitamin D, this is about 166 nanomolar, is about twice the level that's usually targeted in older children or adults, was found with infants giving somewhat higher doses of 500 units per day who are very low birth weight. Now, those who advocate for vitamin D would tell you that these levels in the serum are 100% completely safe. So, again, this is a controversy that's going on right now. It's not a controversy limited to premature infants. In fact, for the most part, premature infants are not part of this controversy. But it's talked about a lot, and I wanted to kind of present the evidence on both sides about that. That's again. This was in one other study that was presented from Japan, again looking at very high levels of vitamin D intake, showing similar high levels of serum vitamin D, about twice that usually targeted, but generally within realms accepted as safe. So whether or not you think adding a lot of vitamin D is useful or not perhaps depends upon your opinion of vitamin D, but there are no data at all that demonstrate any benefit of high-dose vitamin D for premature infants. It cannot replace giving enough calcium and phosphorus. La siguiente. I want to just talk about, almost done here, talk about a couple of exceptions to this. Vitamin D-related absorption of calcium does increase by about 2 months or so of age, at a time when in very small babies osteopenia can worsen. So for some of our older, very tiny babies, we'll bring up the vitamin D intake a little bit, again without much evidence of benefit, but we'll do that anyway. The other situation is babies who have cholestatic jaundice, an increased level of conjugated bilirubin. Those babies don't form 25-hydroxyvitamin D in the liver. They don't conjugate and they don't make vitamin D or utilize it normally. And for those babies, we'll often bring up their vitamin D through the use of multivitamins. In rare cases, we need to give the activated form of vitamin D, Rocaltrol or calcitriol. The measurement of 125-hydroxyvitamin D in the serum, however, is really not clinically useful in this circumstance. So post-discharge breastfed infants and the risk of bone mineralization. This is an area also of controversy, and the question here we're asking is, if you have a very, very small baby, and the baby is going to go home exclusively breastfed, does that baby have a risk of developing rickets after they go home? In general, the answer is it's extremely low, and most of those babies do extremely well. And in fact, although many people in the United States will recommend that some calcium supplement or some formula be given for the very smallest babies, there really is no compelling reason from a bone health perspective to do that. Now, for other growth reasons, I think they'll be talked about, but from a bone health reason, which is what we're going to talk about here, there are no compelling data that say you need to do it. And so I just wanted to point that out. Sometimes we'll monitor the baby after hospital discharge, look at their growth, and things like that. In our hospital, most babies who go home who are born less than about 1,000 grams were also born at 23 to 25 weeks gestation. And about a half of those will have bronchopulmonary dysplasia and go home fluid restricted. And some of those babies will not be able to take in the 180 to 200 mLs per kilo per day of breast milk that they might need, and those babies will generally supplement. La siguiente. What about long-term consequences of rickets? There really aren't a whole lot of data about this. Alan Lucas and the group a number of years ago found that when the baby had an alkaline phosphatase activity greater than 1,200 international units per liter, that they had a lower length at 18 months and a lower height at 9 to 12 years of age. Next. In general, there's relatively little long-term data. Long-term data is pretty minimal. The usual height z-scores are about minus 0.5 in early adolescence. Bone mass generally follows size and is proportionally reduced. And there's no evidence of neonatal feeding type on pre-adolescent bone mass. And this, by the way, is all the same 800-gram child in my arms in 1985 and now as a college senior last year. So sometimes very tiny babies do really quite well. La siguiente. And the final point is there's a little bit of relatively new data looking at whole body bone mineral content. Long term, this was about 7-8 years of age in Canada. Usually, again, it's been said that there isn't a long-term deficit. In this study, if we just look over here, those babies who received dexamethasone had a very low bone mass compared to those who were full-term. Those who were very low birth weight, even when corrected for size, had a slight decrease in bone mass. This is actually from Ecuador. Hace 2 semanas fui en Ecuador a Quito. Es la foto de 2 bebés juntos. Gracias.